My parents always favored my brother. He was their golden child, and now they're pleading for my help after he kicked them out of their home. I've always been the overlooked kid, in the background. My older brother, Caleb, was the center of their universe. To Maggie and Rick, he could do no wrong, and even when he did, I was somehow to blame. If Caleb left his toys out, I was supposed to clean them up. If he got poor grades, it was because I had distracted him. I learned quickly that in our family, Caleb's needs came first, while mine barely registered. I still vividly remember my 8th birthday. Caleb had a soccer game that same day, so my parents decided to merge the celebrations. I spent the entire afternoon sitting on the bleachers watching my brothers score goals while Maggie and Rick cheered like crazed fans. By the time the game ended, everyone was too tired to bother with a proper cake, so they handed me a store-bought cupcake with a half-melted candle. Caleb walked away with a trophy. I got a shrug and a maybe next year, kiddo. Fast forward to adulthood, and nothing had changed. Caleb remained their pride and joy, boasting a high-powered corporate job, a flashy car, and endless tales of success. Meanwhile, I worked as a freelance graphic designer, a career my dad often dismissed as playing with computers. I wasn't bitter. Not all the time, at least. I had carved out a small but stable life for myself, complete with my own apartment, a close group of friends, and Olivia, my girlfriend, who constantly reminded me I deserved more than the scraps my family threw my way. Then, everything shifted a few weeks ago. It started with a late-night phone call at 10 p.m., the kind you know can't bring good news. When Maggie's name lit up my screen, I hesitated to answer. Guilt, that ever-present remnant of my childhood, forced me to pick up. "Jacob, honey," she began, her voice spilled out like a bad soap opera. "Caleb, the perfect son, had cut them off completely. No explanations, no warnings, just a cold severance. It wasn't just emotional. He had drained their joint savings account, taken over their house through legal loopholes, and left them with nothing but the clothes they wore. "We're at the Greyhound station," Maggie said. "Can we come to your place?" I froze. Every logical part of me screamed to say no. These were the same parents who had ignored me for years, who had always prioritized Caleb, but then I pictured them sitting in that bus station, two aging parents with no place to go. Despite my resentment, I couldn't let them sleep on a bench. "Fine," I said through gritted teeth. "Come over." When they arrived, they were unrecognizable. Rick's shoulders sagged as though he carried the weight of the world, and Maggie's eyes were swollen from crying. They shuffled into my apartment, murmuring apologies and thanks. I wanted to feel triumphant, to revel in the irony of them needing me after all this time. Instead, I just felt drained. "I'll set up the guest room," I said, retreating before they could say anything else. The next few days were suffocating. My apartment wasn't big, and having them there made me feel like a guest in my own home. Rick, true to form, couldn't resist his usual digs. "You should really think about getting a real job, Jake. Something with benefits." Maggie tried to smooth things over, but her efforts only irritated me further. "He's just worried about you, sweetie. You know, your brother wouldn't be in this situation if he were freelancing." The mention of Caleb hit like a slap in the face. "Are you seriously comparing me to him right now?" I snapped. "He's the reason you're here, or did you forget that?" Silence filled the room. Maggie looked on the verge of tears, and Rick muttered something under his breath about my attitude. Furious, I stormed out, slamming the door behind me. I needed air, space, anything to escape. I called Zach, my best friend since high school, and vented everything. "So now they expect me to play the dutiful son," I ranted, pacing the sidewalk outside my building. "After years of treating me like an afterthought, they want me to clean up their mess." "You don't owe them anything, man," Zach said firmly. "They made their bed, they can lie in it. But knowing you're gonna help them anyway." I hated how right he was. No matter how much I wanted to walk away, I couldn't. Not yet, at least. When I returned to the apartment, Maggie was sitting on the couch, clutching a mug of tea like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "I know we've made mistakes, Jacob," she said softly, "but we're trying to make things right. Please, don't give up on us." Her words struck something deep inside me, something I wasn't ready to confront. I sighed, rubbing my temples. "We'll figure it out," I said. "But things have to change." I didn't realize this was only the beginning. The cracks in our family's foundation ran deeper than I had imagined, and the buried secrets were about to resurface in ways I could never have anticipated. Having my parents in my apartment felt like reliving every uncomfortable memory from my childhood, but magnified. The small space seemed to amplify everything. Rick's passive-aggressive remarks, Maggie's overbearing need to micromanage, and the constant tension that hung over us like a storm cloud. It didn't take long before I started dreading coming home. To preserve some sanity, I laid down a few ground rules. No talking about Caleb, no unsolicited advice about my life, and no rearranging my belongings. Naturally, none of these rules stuck. Rick couldn't help but mutter, "If Caleb lived here, this place would probably look better," by way of Maggie thought she was being helpful by reorganizing my pantry, only to leave me searching for my coffee filters for 15 minutes. I confided in Olivia during one of our late-night phone calls. "I feel like a stranger in my own home," I admitted. "It's like they've turned this place into Caleb's failure recovery zone, except he's not the one here." "Why don't you tell them to leave?" Olivia asked gently. "You've already done more for them than they ever did for you." "I can't," I said, frustration lacing my voice. "They have nowhere else to go." She sighed. "You've got the biggest heart, Jake. Just make sure you're not sacrificing your happiness for theirs." Her words stuck with me, but I still didn't know how to set boundaries with Maggie and Rick. Everything reached a boiling point when Aunt Patty called me out of the blue. Patty, Maggie's older sister, wasn't someone I was close to, but she had always been a voice of reason amid family chaos. "I heard about Caleb," she said without any preamble. "I'm guessing your parents didn't tell you the full story." I gripped my phone tightly, frowning. "What do you mean?" I asked. Patty sighed. "It's not my place to explain, but let's just say Caleb didn't cut ties with them without a good reason. You might want to ask your parents why they're really in this mess." Her cryptic words planted a seed of doubt that grew steadily over the next few days. I started noticing inconsistencies in Maggie and Rick's account of what happened. They claimed Caleb had drained their savings, but when I asked how he had access, Maggie brushed it off with a vague, "It's complicated." Rick insisted Caleb had taken the house through manipulation, but when I pressed him for details, he snapped, "Why are you interrogating us? Haven't we suffered enough?" Their evasive answers only confirmed that they weren't telling me everything. One night, after Rick had gone to bed, I cornered Maggie in the kitchen. "What's really going on?" I demanded. "Why did Caleb cut you off?" Her face turned pale, and she avoided my gaze, focusing instead on her tea. "Jacob, it's not as simple as you think," she murmured. "Then explain it to me," I pressed, "because from where I'm standing, none of this makes sense." Maggie hesitated for what felt like an eternity before finally whispering, "Your brother got involved with some bad people. He needed help, and we made sacrifices to support him." "Sacrifices?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You mean giving him all your money in the house?" "It wasn't like that," she said quickly, tears welling in her eyes. "We thought we were helping him get back on his feet. He promised to repay us." "And did he?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Maggie shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "He was furious when we asked for the money back. He called us selfish and ungrateful, and then he just left." I stared at her, trying to process everything. Caleb wasn't just the golden child. He was a disaster waiting to happen, and Maggie and Rick had handed him the means to destroy everything. When I told Zach about the conversation the next day, he wasn't surprised. "Classic golden child syndrome," he said. "They spoiled him rotten, and now they're paying the price." "Yo, but why does it have to be my problem?" I snapped. "I didn't ask for any of this." "It's not your problem," Zach said firmly, "but they've made it yours, because they know you'll fix it." His words hit me like a freight train. All my life I'd been cleaning up Caleb's messes, even when it wasn't fair, and now, even in his absence, I was left picking up the pieces. A few days later, Aunt Patty called again, this time with no cryptic warnings. "Caleb's been gambling for years," she said. "He got in deep with the wrong crowd. Your parents bailed him out more times than I can count, and now they've got nothing left." Her revelation left me stunned, and the world of people like me shattered below the force of crisis. Caleb's perfect life was a facade built on lies and my parents' blind loyalty. But the real blow came when Patty added, "He even tried to blame you, you know." "What?" I asked, incredulous. "Told your parents you refused to help him when he needed it," Patty said. "That you were selfish and ungrateful. I don't know if they believed him, but it definitely caused some tension." My mind reeled. Caleb hadn't just ruined my parents financially, he had also tried to paint me as the villain in his mess. I felt a surge of anger unlike anything I'd experienced in years. I'd spent my life playing the responsible son, keeping my head down and enduring their favoritism, but now I wasn't sure I could keep doing it. That evening I walked into the apartment to find Rick watching TV like he owned the place, while Maggie hummed to herself in the kitchen. They seemed so at ease, oblivious to the chaos they had brought into my life. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to make them confront the damage they'd done. Instead, I went to my room and shut the door. I wasn't ready to face them, not yet. But I knew one thing for certain: this house of resentment couldn't hold us all for much longer. The days dragged on, and the tension in my apartment became unbearable. It wasn't just the old grievances anymore. It was the weight of everything I'd learned about Caleb. He wasn't just the golden child who could do no wrong. He was a fraud who had manipulated our parents into financial ruin, yet somehow they still treated him like a saint. One night, after a grueling day at work, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I tossed my bag onto the couch and faced Rick and Maggie. "We need to talk," I said, my tone sharper than intended. Rick muted the TV, giving me an annoyed look. "What's this about?" "Caleb," I replied. "I know about the gambling." Maggie's face went pale, and Rick's expression hardened. "Who told you that?" he asked defensively. "Does it matter?" I shot back. "What matters is that you've been lying to me. You let Caleb gamble away your savings, your house, your future, and now you expect me to fix it?" Maggie started crying, as she always did when things got uncomfortable. "We didn't know what else to do, Jacob," she said. "He was in trouble, and we thought we could help." "Help?" I laughed bitterly. "You enabled him, and now, even after all this, you refuse to hold him accountable. Do you even understand what you've done? To yourselves? To me?" Rick stood up, his face red with anger. "Watch your tone," he barked. "We're still your parents." "No," I snapped. "You're Caleb's parents. I was just the backup plan, and now that he's abandoned you, you're here because you have no one else." Maggie sobbed harder, but Rick just glared at me, his jaw tightening. "You don't know what it's like to have a child in trouble," he said. "We did what any good parents would do." "Good parents?" I repeated, shaking my head. "Good parents don't sacrifice one child for the sake of the other. Good parents don't ignore years of bad behavior because it's easier than facing reality." Rick didn't respond. The room fell silent except for Maggie's quiet crying. I felt a pang of guilt but shoved it aside. They needed to hear this. "You're right about one thing," I said. "I don't know what it's like to have a child in trouble, but I do know what it's like to be the child who's always overlooked, and I'm done being that kid." I stormed out before they could say another word, desperate for air and distance from their suffocating presence. I ended up at a diner across town, where Zach joined me after I sent him a frantic text. "You finally confronted them?" he asked, sliding into the booth. I muttered, staring at my coffee. "It didn't go well." "It was never going to go well, Jake," Zach said, shaking his head. "People like your parents don't want to face the truth." They had spent years ignoring reality, and now it was catching up to them. I ran a hand through my hair, letting out a frustrated sigh. I don't know what to do anymore. I can't keep living like this." "You don't have to," Zach said firmly. "You've already done more than enough. If they can't see that, it's their problem, not yours." His words made sense, but guilt clung to me, refusing to let go. As much as I wanted to walk away, some part of me still felt responsible for them, and I hated that about myself. A week later, things took an unexpected turn. Aunt Patty called again, this time with shocking news. "Caleb's back in town," she said. "I saw him at the grocery store yesterday." My stomach churned. Did he say anything? Patty paused. "He didn't see me, but I overheard him talking to someone. He mentioned your parents. It didn't sound good." I gripped the phone tighter. "What did he say?" "Said they were dead to him," Patty replied, her voice heavy. "He's completely cut them off, Jake. He's not coming back." Hearing it out loud hit harder than I expected. I didn't care much about Caleb's relationship with our parents, but his words made everything feel more real. Caleb was done with him, which meant the responsibility now fell squarely on me, whether I liked it or not. A few days later, I saw Caleb with my own eyes. On my way home from the grocery store, I spotted him sitting on a bench, scrolling through his phone. He looked different, thinner, more worn out. The confident, charming older brother I'd grown up with was gone, replaced by someone who looked like they'd been through hell. Before I could stop myself, I walked over. Yeah. He glanced up, startled. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something. Guilt? Shame? But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual smug demeanor. "Jay," he said, leaning back casually. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I could say the same," I replied. "Heard you're back in town." He shrugged. "Not for long, just tying up some loose ends." "Like screwing over Mom and Dad?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. Caleb smirked, though there was no humor in it. "They screwed themselves, Jake. I just stopped playing along." "By taking their money? Their house?" I shot back. "They gave it to me," he said flatly. "I didn't force them. They made their choices just like I made mine." I stared at him, searching for any sign of regret, but there was nothing. Caleb had burned every bridge in his life and didn't seem to care. "You're unbelievable," I said, shaking my head. "They sacrificed everything for you, and you couldn't even... "Spare me the lecture," Caleb interrupted, standing up. "You think you're better than me? You're just as stuck with them as I was. Good luck with that." Without another word, he walked away, leaving me standing there seething and helpless. For years, I had envied Caleb's place in our family, but now I realized it had been a curse all along. Yes, he'd been the golden child, but he was also their scapegoat, savior, and everything in between. Now that he was gone, they were clinging to me like a lifeline. I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. Having Caleb back in town added another layer of tension to the already unbearable situation at home. His presence lingered even when he wasn't physically there. My parents avoided mentioning him, but their silence spoke volumes. Maggie would sit for hours, staring blankly at her tea, while Rick grew even more irritable and dismissive. Meanwhile, I felt like I was unraveling. I had sacrificed my peace and privacy to help them, but all I received in return was criticism and guilt. Olivia tried to be supportive, but even she was starting to feel the strain. "Maybe we should take a weekend away," she suggested during one of our rare dinners together. "Just you and me? Recharge a little." "I wish I could," I said, rubbing my temples, "but I can't just leave them." "Jake," Olivia said, frowning, "you're allowed to set boundaries. You don't owe them your entire life." "I know," I replied, but the words felt hollow. No matter how much I wanted to prioritize myself, the weight of my parents' dependence made it impossible. Things came to a head one night when I overheard Maggie and Rick arguing in the living room. Their voices were low, but the thin walls of my apartment offered no privacy. "We can't keep doing this," Maggie was saying. "He's going to crack." "I'll be fine," Rick replied gruffly. "He's tougher than you think." I stepped into the room, crossing my arms. "Care to fill me in?" They both froze, looking like they'd been caught red-handed. Maggie wrung her hands, avoiding eye contact, while Rick glared at me. "It's nothing," Rick said. "Go back to bed." "Don't talk to me like I'm a child," I snapped. "If this is about me, I have a right to know." Maggie sighed, finally meeting my gaze. "Just worried about you, Jacob. You've been so stressed lately, and we don't want to be a burden." "Too late for that," I muttered under my breath. "What was that?" Rick asked sharply. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. "Look, I'm doing my best here, but this isn't sustainable. You need to come up with a long-term plan, because I can't keep carrying all of this." Rick's face turned red. "We didn't ask for this, Jacob. Do you think we wanted to lose everything?" "No, but you let it happen," I shot back. "And now you're here, expecting me to clean up your mess without so much as a thank you." "Jacob, please," Maggie said, her voice trembling. "We're trying to make things right. We don't know how." Her words tugged at my heart, but I refused to let my guard down. "Figure it out," I said, "because if you don't, this isn't going to end well for any of us." I left the room before they could respond, my hands shaking with anger. I hated how easily they could get under my skin, how years of conditioning had made it nearly impossible for me to say no to them. I wanted to believe they were genuinely trying to change, but their actions told a different story. The next day, Aunt Patty called again. She had been my lifeline through this ordeal, offering advice and encouragement when I needed it most. This time, though, her tone was different, more serious. "Jacob, you need to think about yourself," she said bluntly. "Your parents made their choices, and they have to live with the consequences. You can't keep sacrificing your happiness for their mistakes." "I know," I said, though I didn't fully believe it. "But it's not that simple." "It is that simple," she insisted. "You've done more for them than anyone could have expected. But if you keep this up, you're going to lose yourself in the process." Her words stuck with me, echoing in my mind as I tried to focus on work. That evening, Olivia called to check in, and I finally opened up about how overwhelmed I felt. "I just don't know what to do," I admitted. "No matter what I say or do, it feels like I'm stuck in this endless cycle." "Maybe it's time to break the cycle," Olivia said gently. "Set an ultimatum. Make them understand you can't keep living like this." The thought was both terrifying and liberating. I hesitated, unsure if I had the strength to follow through. "But what if they don't listen?" I asked. "Then you'll know where you stand," Olivia replied, "and you can start putting yourself first." That night, I made up my mind. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, torn between guilt and resentment. It was time to take control of my life, even if it risked damaging the fragile relationship I had with my parents. The next morning, I sat Maggie and Rick down at the kitchen table. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to speak. "We need to talk," I began, keeping my voice steady despite the nerves tightening my chest. I've done everything I can to help you, but this can't go on. You need to find a way to support yourselves because I can't keep doing it." Rick opened his mouth to protest, but I raised a hand to stop him. "Let me finish," I said firmly. "I love you both, but I've spent my entire life being second to Caleb. I'm not letting that happen anymore. I deserve to have my own life, and I'm not going to sacrifice it because of your mistakes." Maggie started crying, but I didn't waver. "This isn't me abandoning you," I continued. "This is me setting boundaries. I'll help you figure out a plan, but after that, you are on your own." Rick's face was filled with fury, but he stayed silent. Maggie nodded weakly, tears streaming down her face. For the first time, I felt a faint spark of hope, as though I was finally taking control of my own life. But deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. The cracks in our family ran too deep to be repaired overnight, and the real challenge was still ahead. The aftermath of my ultimatum felt like a brief calm before an inevitable storm. Maggie and Rick seemed to tread lightly around me, their usual criticisms replaced by a strained silence. For the first time, I felt like I had some semblance of control in our relationship. But I knew this peace wouldn't last. Years of dysfunction and resentment don't disappear after one conversation. True to my word, I started looking into resources for them. I researched affordable housing programs, local job placement services, and even charities that could help them rebuild their lives. Maggie quietly thanked me when I handed her a list of leads, but Rick, unsurprisingly, said nothing. His pride wouldn't allow it. Meanwhile, Caleb's shadow loomed larger than ever. Aunt Patty called again, with more updates about his return. Apparently, Caleb had been spotted at a bar downtown, ranting about the family and how he was done with all of us. According to Patty, he wasn't just cutting ties. He was burning bridges. "You should be careful, Jacob," she warned. "Caleb's in a bad place. If he finds out your parents are staying with you, he might try to cause trouble." At the time, I didn't think much of it. Caleb had always been reckless and self-centered, but I never considered him a threat. And that assumption would come back to haunt me. A week later, everything fell apart. It started with an unexpected visit from Aunt Patty. She arrived at my apartment looking more frazzled than I'd ever seen her. Maggie and Rick were in the living room when she walked in, and their expressions immediately turned to dread. "What's going on?" I asked, already bracing for bad news. "It's Caleb," Patty said, her voice tight with stress. "He's been telling people that you've taken over the family's finances. He's making it sound like you're controlling them." "What?" I said, my jaw dropping. "That's ridiculous." "I know," Patty replied, "but he's spreading the story to anyone who'll listen. He's even talked to some of the extended family, and now they're starting to think you're taking advantage of your parents." I stared at her, completely stunned. After everything I'd done, everything I'd sacrificed, Caleb was trying to destroy me. My hands clenched into fists as anger coursed through me. "This is insane," I said. "Why would he do this?" Maggie and Rick exchanged a nervous glance. It was clear they knew more than they were letting on. "What aren't you telling me?" I demanded. Maggie hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. "He's angry, Jacob," she said softly. "He thinks we betrayed him by coming to you. He blames us for everything that's happened. Instead of owning up to his actions, he's making me the scapegoat," I said bitterly. Typical Caleb. Rick finally spoke, his tone gruff. "We didn't ask him to do this. We've been trying to keep you out of it." "Not hard enough," I snapped. "He's out there ruining my reputation, and you're just sitting here doing nothing." Before they could respond, my phone buzzed. It was Olivia. I stepped into the hallway to answer, my heart racing. "Jake, you need to get online," she said, her voice urgent. "Caleb posted something about you." "What do you mean?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. "Check your social media," she said. "I'll call you back." I hung up and opened my phone, my hands trembling. Sure enough, Caleb had posted a long, rambling message accusing me of exploiting our parents. He claimed I'd forced them out of their home, taken their money, and left them with nothing. The post was riddled with lies, but written convincingly enough to gain sympathy from people who didn't know the truth. The comments flooded in, some from family members, others from strangers. Words like ungrateful and manipulative jumped out at me, each one cutting like a knife. My anger morphed into panic as I realized the extent of the damage Caleb was causing. I called Olivia back, barely able to keep my voice steady. "He's trying to destroy me," I said. "Then you need to fight back," she replied. "Tell your side of the story. Don't let him control the narrative." I wanted to believe it was that simple, but years of being overshadowed by Caleb had left me full of doubt. Who would believe me over him? The breaking point came that evening when Maggie and Rick tried to defend Caleb. "He's just lashing out," Maggie said, her voice trembling. "He's hurt, Jacob. He feels abandoned." "So that gives him the right to lie about me?" I snapped. "To ruin my life because he can't face the consequences of his own actions?" Rick scowled. "He's your brother. Family forgives." I stared at them, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. Family forgives? Funny how that only seems to apply to Caleb. When have you ever forgiven me for not being him? The room went silent. For the first time, they had no response. And in that moment, I realized something profound. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their validation. I had spent my entire life chasing something they were never going to give me. The next day, I made a decision. I reached out to Aunt Patty and arranged a family meeting. If Caleb wanted to drag me through the mud, I was going to confront him head on, and I wasn't going to do it alone. The meeting was held at Patty's house, neutral territory where no one could claim an advantage. Caleb arrived late, as smug as ever. He didn't even acknowledge me, instead greeting Maggie and Rick like nothing had happened. "Let's get this over with," I said, crossing my arms. "Caleb, you've been lying about me. You've been spreading rumors and trying to make me look like the villain. Why?" Caleb shrugged. "If the shoe fits." "Cut the crap," I snapped. "I've spent my whole life cleaning up after you, and I'm done. You don't get to ruin me just because you're miserable." The room erupted into chaos. Maggie begged us to stop fighting. Rick tried to play peacemaker, and Aunt Patty yelled for everyone to calm down. But I didn't let Caleb off the hook. "You want to talk about betrayal?" I said, my voice slicing through the noise. "You betrayed all of us. You lied, you stole, and now you're trying to destroy what little family we have left. You're a coward, Caleb, and I'm not cleaning up your mess anymore." For the first time, Caleb looked rattled. He didn't have a snarky comeback or a smug remark. He just sat there, his face pale, as the weight of my words sank in. When the meeting ended, I walked out without looking back. I knew I'd done the right thing, but it still hurt. Breaking the cycle wasn't easy, and it came at a cost. In the weeks that followed, I started to rebuild my life. Maggie and Rick eventually moved into a small apartment, funded by a mix of charity and the resources I'd found for them. Caleb disappeared again, leaving behind the wreckage of his golden boy legacy. And me. For the first time, I felt free from the guilt, the resentment, and the constant comparisons. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was mine, and for the first time, that was enough. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe and listen to new ones daily. Let us know in the comments what you liked most and what could have been better.